Hitchcock was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentence of the state of Florida versus James Ernest Hitchcock was carried out at 6:12 p.m. on April 30th, 2026. The execution took place without incident.
On April 30th, 2026, at 6 o'clock in the evening, a man took his last breath inside Florida State Prison in Rayford. His name was James Ernest Hitchcock. And for the people sitting in that witness room, it was a moment 50 years in the making. 50 years. Think about that for a second. A little girl was murdered in 1976, and her family had to wake up every single day knowing her killer was still alive, still eating, still breathing, while she lay in the ground at just 13 years old. Her name was Cindy Driggers. She was the oldest of 5 kids. She had a quiet little giggle that her family never forgot. She dreamed of becoming a flight attendant one day. And on the night of July 31st, 1976, the man who was supposed to be family walked into her bedroom and took everything from her. He confessed to police, word for word, no hesitation. And then, just as quickly, he took it all back and pointed the finger at someone else entirely. 13 family members were in that witness room on April 30th to watch him die, including Cindy's 81-year-old mother, who never stopped setting a place at the table for her daughter. Welcome to the Dark Verdict. If you want to follow every update as this case moves forward, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. We cover death row from execution through every stage of what comes next. You will hear about it here first. Now, let us get into what actually happened. To understand why this case matters so deeply, you need to know who Cindy Driggers was before any of this happened. Not just her name, not just her age, who she actually was as a person. Cynthia Ann Driggers was 13 years old. She was the oldest of 5 children, 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. And from the very beginning, she took that role seriously. She was not the loudest kid in the room. She was not the one demanding attention, but she was always the one making sure everyone else was okay. Her cousin, Jeannie Meadows, who is now 69 years old, described her in a way that is hard to forget. She said, "If you could paint a picture of innocence in a little girl making her way through the world with always a happy and loving heart, that's her." Jeannie was 19 when Cindy was murdered. She has carried that image ever since. Cindy's mother, Helen Judy Hitchcock, who is now 81 years old, remembers a childhood that was simple and full. The kids were always outside, climbing trees, playing hide-and-seek, throwing a baseball around the yard. Cindy did her chores without being told twice. She did her homework, and then she would run straight back outside to be with her brothers and sisters. Helen said it plainly. It was just a big, happy family. Cindy was also a quiet dreamer. She had a goal. She wanted to become a flight attendant one day. She had that kind of spirit, the kind that looks at the world and sees possibility. She had a little giggle that her family loved, and a smile, Jeannie said, that you just could not help but notice even when Cindy was trying to blend into the background. Her birthday was August 3rd, just 3 days after she was killed. She would have turned 14. This year, in 2026, she would have turned 64. Helen still thinks about that. She wonders what Cindy would have looked like grown up. Would she have been tall like some of her siblings? Or shorter like her mom? Did she ever actually become a flight attendant? These are questions that never got answers, and they never will. When Cindy was killed, Helen said the whole family was simply lost. The younger children did not know what to do with themselves. And Helen, she kept setting a plate at the dinner table for her daughter. She did that for a long time. But here is the image that has stayed with this family through every single court hearing, every appeal, every delay across 50 years. It is not a smiling school photo. It is the last photo ever taken of Cindy Driggers. Her face bruised and bloodied, her body thrown into the bushes, dirt and mud covering her face, and running down her cheek. A single tear track. That is the image her cousin Jeannie brought to the Florida legislature. Not to shock people, but because she wanted them to truly understand what this little girl went through in her final moments. That image never leaves you, and it never left her family either. Now, before we get into what happened that night, we need to talk about the man who did it. Because in cases like this, people always ask the same question. How does someone get to a place where they are capable of something like this? James Ernest Hitchcock was born on April 5th, 1956, in Arkansas. He grew up in Manila, Arkansas, alongside 6 siblings. And from the very beginning, life was hard. The family lived in a shack. His parents made their living picking cotton. There was no comfort, no cushion, nothing extra, just survival day after day. When James was just 6 years old, his father was diagnosed with skin cancer, and he died. Just like that, the man of the house was gone, and a 6-year-old boy was left trying to make sense of a world that had already taken something from him. His mother eventually remarried, but the new man in the house was not a good one. His stepfather was abusive toward his mother, and young James watched it happen. He endured it for years, until he could not take it anymore. At 13 years old, he packed up and ran away from home. Think about that. 13 years old. The same age as Cindy Driggers. Despite everything, the poverty, the loss, the abuse, the running, James Hitchcock did something that nobody in his family had ever done before. He finished school. He earned his high school diploma. He was the first in his entire family to do it. And for a moment, it looked like maybe he had found a way through. But it did not last. At some point before 1976, Hitchcock was convicted of burglary in Arkansas. He served time and was released on parole. By the summer of 1976, he was jobless, out on parole, and had nowhere to go. So he did what a lot of people do when they have nothing. He called family. His brother took him in. He moved into his brother's home in Winter Garden, Florida, about 2 to 3 weeks before the murder. He was 20 years old. He had no job, no plan, and no real direction. There was no documented history of violence against women or children before this. No prior record of anything like what was about to happen. And after his conviction, inmates who were locked up alongside him on death row actually described him as a calm person. A peacemaker, they called him. Someone who kept the peace rather than stirred up trouble. But here's the thing about that. None of it changes what he did on the night of July 31st, 1976. A hard childhood explains a lot of things in life. It does not explain walking into a 13-year-old girl's bedroom in the middle of the night. There is no explanation for that. There is only what happened. It was the evening of July 30th, 1976. A warm Florida night. Inside the family home in Winter Garden, James Hitchcock sat with his brother's family and watched television until around 11 o'clock at night. Nothing unusual, just a normal evening. But then Hitchcock left the house. He went out into Winter Garden with friends. He spent the night drinking and smoking marijuana. By the time he was done, it was well past midnight. He made his way back to the house at around 2:30 in the morning, but instead of walking through the front door like a normal person, he climbed in through the dining room window. Nobody heard him come in. He went to his bedroom, but he did not stay there. What happened next is known almost entirely from one source, Hitchcock's own confession, which he gave to police shortly after his arrest. And the words he used are not easy to hear, but they matter, because they tell you exactly what kind of night Cindy Driggers had. Hitchcock entered her bedroom while she was asleep. She was 13 years old. He raped her. When it was over, Cindy told him she was hurt. She said she was going to tell her mother what he had done. Those were her exact words. She was hurt, and she was going to tell her mama. Hitchcock's response, in his own words to police, was this: "I said, you can't." But Cindy was not backing down. She said she had to tell. She was hurt, and she needed her mother. She started to get up from the bed. Hitchcock would not let her, and when she began to cry out, he grabbed her by the neck to stop her from making noise. Then, he picked her up and carried her outside. Outside in the dark, he tried again to convince her to stay quiet. He told her she could not say anything, but Cindy, this 13-year-old girl who had just been through something no child should ever experience, she still refused. She said she had to tell. She was hurt. She needed help. And then she screamed. Hitchcock grabbed her by the throat. He choked her. And when that was not enough to silence her, he hit her. Twice. He continued choking her. He strangled her until she stopped moving, until she stopped making any sound at all. Then he threw her body into the bushes. He walked back into the house. He took a shower. He washed his clothes. And then he went to bed. That is the part that is almost impossible to process. Not just what he did, but what he did afterward. He cleaned himself up and went to sleep, as if nothing had happened, as if a little girl was not lying in the bushes outside. The next morning, Cindy's mother woke up and noticed her daughter was not in the house. She searched. She called out, "Nothing." Later that day, Cindy's stepfather went outside and found her body in the bushes where Hitchcock had left her. She was still 13 years old. Her 14th birthday was 3 days away. August 3rd. 3 days! When investigators examined Cindy's body, what they found confirmed the full horror of what she had been through. The physical evidence told the story of a violent, prolonged attack. At Hitchcock's sentencing, Florida's then Ninth Circuit judge, Michael Psychmanic, struggled to find the right words. He said he had great difficulty in expressing the horror, suffering, and physical and emotional trauma the child victim must have experienced. He went further. He described what Cindy endured, the sexual assault, being dragged from her home in the middle of the night, the beatings, the choking, and he said plainly that he could not find words for what she must have gone through. Then he used 3 words that have followed this case ever since. It was heinous, it was cruel. It was atrocious. Hitchcock was arrested the very next day after the murder. And when police sat him down, he talked. He gave them the full account. The drinking, the window, the bedroom, the bushes. All of it. Word for word. He did not hold back. But then something shifted. By the time his case went to trial, Hitchcock had changed his story completely. The confession was gone, and in its place was a version of events that pointed the finger at someone else entirely, someone who was supposed to be beyond suspicion. And that is where the story gets even more complicated. When the sun came up on August 1st, 1976, the house in Winter Garden looked quiet from the outside, but inside, something was already wrong. Cindy's mother woke up that morning and noticed her daughter was not there. She was not in her bedroom. She was not in the house. For a mother, that kind of silence has a weight to it. Something felt off immediately. Her stepfather went outside to look, and that is when he found her. Cindy's body lying in the bushes where Hitchcock had thrown her the night before, bruised, bloodied, gone. The call went out. Police arrived. And within a very short time, attention turned to the man who had been sleeping under the same roof, James Ernest Hitchcock. He was taken in as a suspect the very next day after the murder, August 1st, 1976. And then he did something that surprised investigators. He talked. Hitchcock sat down with police and gave a full, detailed confession. He walked them through the entire night, the drinking, climbing through the window, entering Cindy's bedroom, what he did to her, dragging her outside, strangling her, throwing her in the bushes, showering, going to bed. All of it. Calmly, in his own words. For investigators, that confession was the backbone of the entire case. But here's where things get complicated. By the time the case went to trial, Hitchcock had completely changed his story. He told the court that he never killed Cindy. He claimed that Cindy had willingly been with him and that his own brother had discovered them together and killed her in a fit of rage. He said he had only confessed to protect his brother. The jury did not believe him, but the physical evidence available at the time had its limits. This was 1976. There was no DNA testing, no digital trail, no forensic technology that could place him at the scene beyond what the human eye could see and what his own mouth had already said. Decades later, Hitchcock's legal team would push for DNA testing on physical evidence from the scene. The Florida Supreme Court denied that request in January 2004, ruling that no DNA result could change the outcome of his sentence. By then, some of that critical evidence had already been lost or destroyed entirely. The cops had his words, but the technology that could have settled every remaining question, it simply did not exist yet when it mattered most. On February 11, 1977, less than a year after Cindy's murder, James Ernest Hitchcock stood in a Florida courtroom and was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury recommended death. Judge Psychmanic sentenced him to die in the electric chair. That should have been the end of it. It was not even close to the end. What followed was one of the longest legal journeys in Florida death row history. A back and forth between courts that stretched across 5 decades and left Cindy's family trapped in what her younger sister later called an inescapable loop. In April 1987, the United States Supreme Court unanimously overturned Hitchcock's death sentence. The court found that the original trial judge had wrongly limited the defense from presenting evidence that could have worked in Hitchcock's favor during sentencing. That ruling became a landmark case and affected roughly 50 other prisoners on Florida's death row at the time. A new sentencing jury voted 7-5 for death in February 1988. Judge Formey followed their recommendation and sentenced Hitchcock to death again. Then, in June 1992, the United States Supreme Court overturned that sentence too, this time because the jury had used an improper standard. A third jury came back in 1993 with a unanimous death recommendation. But in March 1996, the Florida Supreme Court threw that one out as well, ruling that unverified allegations introduced during sentencing had made the process unfair. A fourth jury voted 10-2 for death that same year. Judge Psych Manick, the same judge from the original trial, sentenced Hitchcock to death for the fourth time. In March 2000, the Florida Supreme Court finally upheld that sentence. DNA testing was denied in 2004. Post-conviction appeals were rejected in 2008, 2014, and 2017. Through all of this, Cindy's cousin Jeannie Meadows stood before the Florida legislature in 2000 and testified about the family's suffering. Lawmakers passed a bill to speed up executions. Governor Jeb Bush signed it. But the Florida Supreme Court struck down that portion of the law shortly after. On March 31st, 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Hitchcock's death warrant. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his final appeal on April 24th, 2026. 6 days later, it was over. On April 30th, 2026, at approximately 6:12 in the evening, James Ernest Hitchcock was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Bradford County, Florida. He was 70 years old. 13 members of Cindy's family were present, including her 81-year-old mother, Helen Judy Hitchcock, who had said before entering that witness room, "I want to be there for Cindy, to let her know that we didn't forget her." Hitchcock's final words were not for the family he had destroyed. They were not an apology. He looked up at the ceiling and said, "Just to say goodbye to Joshua, my friend. Thanks for all you've done." His last meal was salad, chicken, ice cream, pie, and soda. He was visited by a family member before the execution was carried out. After the execution, Cindy's sister, Lynn Cobb, stepped outside and addressed reporters. Her words were calm and dignified. She said, "We will continue to remember Cindy by keeping her memory alive and always understanding that life is precious and time is valuable." James Ernest Hitchcock marked Florida's 6th execution in 2026, a state that carried out a record 19 executions the year before. 50 years is a long time to wait. For Cindy's family, it was not just time, it was birthdays without her, empty chairs, dinner plates set for someone who was never coming home. But they showed up. Every court date, every appeal, every setback. They never stopped. For Cindy. Always, if this case moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover death row from beginning to end. When something happens in this case, you will hear about it here first.